Welcome, Wargamers, to the swift swords of the mortal realms, because today we are continuing our discussion of the Stormcast Eternals here in 4th edition by re-examining the Vanguard Chamber. Now, it's technically called the Vanguard-Auxillary Chamber is the full name, but this is one of the earlier model lines that was actually added onto the original Stormcast Eternal models. In fact, with a lot of that Gen 1 stuff going away, pretty soon these will be the oldest model kits still available. And what's great is that they contain units that you are definitely going to see at events or your local game store, read in books. It's just, they're everywhere. And to put it briefly, the Vanguard-Auxillary Chamber, or the Vanguard Chamber, I'm just going to call it that, are the scouts, infiltrators, and assassins of the God King Sigmar, existing outside the normal power structure like the main 3 war chambers we talked about. The Vanguard exists to aid their brothers, but in different and unique ways. And so today in this video, we're going to discuss and explore the Vanguard Chamber as a whole, their fighting tactics, how you'll see them deployed, and also just break down the individual unit lore, and essentially ask how are these Stormcasts different from their main army counterparts, right? And how do they contribute and fit into the greater idea of the Stormcast Eternals as an army, as we know it. Now, one thing I like to add up top here, if you're interested in this faction or anything else, please consider using the affiliate link in my description below. You'll see how much money you save, and every single time you do, a tip goes in my tip jar that directly supports me, my wife, our cats. Just recently, your donations allowed me to go to Holy Havoc, which I will be doing a video review for. I'm so excited about that event, and I just want to bring the narrative here to YouTube. So thank you, each and every one of you who does. Also, if you're looking to learn more about how to play Stormcast on the tabletop, whether it's through written guides, model reviews, painting tutorials, that kind of stuff, go check out Goonhammer. They've got everything you want online. So let's start our examination of the Vanguard-Auxillary Chamber by looking at its structure. Like all Stormcast, their tale begins on the Anvil of Apotheosis. They then get assigned a storm host and given a duty within it, just like we talked about before with everybody else. This is some battlefield role that they can begin training in and become proficient before ever leaving Azyr. And that's kind of a thing that's kind of nebulous, is how long it actually takes from the moment a soul is taken off the ground to that soul being reforged into a battle-ready Stormcast is not very clear. If you're already a Stormcast, you can be reforged pretty quickly, but there's a lot of training that's mentioned and kind of alluded to that we don't see a timeline for. But regardless, what stands out about these heroes in particular who are selected to enter the Vanguard Chamber are essentially 2 defining qualities of that soul. The ability to work alone and in groups, and the second is being quick-witted, or clever and cunning. We kind of pick your word there. And the reason is that every single role in this chamber, meaning all the units that we are going to discuss today, have those 2 things in common. They are given the most autonomy as a chamber and as units to go out and just do the job they need to do. They can operate as a single force, maybe a group of hunters just trying to get from point A to point B, or scout a perimeter, or dissipate into hundreds of smaller forces that are sent out to aid their warrior chamber allies. And we see this a lot in the novels. You'll see like maybe one Vanguard hunter who just shows up and he kind of has some information. That's kind of the idea I'm talking about. It could be squads, or it could just be lending your talents to a specific chamber. And so essentially, if you kind of look at the chamber from a zoomed out perspective, you have a whole host of independent operators and problem solvers, but how do you make them useful, right? How do you turn this into a fighting force? Well, overall, the Vanguard-Auxillary Chamber supports the main armies in a few different ways, and we're going to talk about those. First up are the assassins. So there used to be a hero unit called the Knight Zephyros, but that was sunset. And these were straight up Sigmar's hitmen, right? We actually still have one in the form of Neve Blacktalon. It's a named character version of this rank, and sure enough, if there is a single figure that Sigmar needs dead for whatever reason, this is the chamber that's going to get called to do it subtly. If Sigmar needs a dagger instead of an army, it's going to be pulled from the Vanguard-Auxillary Chamber. Now, we don't have a specific hero or unit that role is assigned to quite as much anymore. That role has kind of gone from the Knight Zephyros specifically to kind of being a feature that the Vanguard Chamber does as a whole. Pinpoint strikes at a long distance. To that end, they do still act as assassins, even though there's not a specific job for it. However, their second largest role is simply mapping the mortal realms, locating realm gates, places of power, places of geomantic power, monitoring troop movements, securing the perimeter, all of that. These are intelligence gatherers with extraordinary eyesight and independent reasoning skills. They can kind of come up with a plan or deduce what the enemy is doing based on what they see. And even if a Vanguard Chamber, character doesn't appear in a story, they likely worked alongside the Stormcast command echelon to get vital battle information about the enemy and the arena in advance. So if you read a story about like the Hallowed Knights just dropping a huge warrior chamber army in, and now they're fighting everybody, they already scouted out that location. They already have eyes there. You just not seeing them in the story. The information that is fed to Lord Celestins to conduct their battle plans and practices is going to come from these eyes and ears. And lastly, they can act as an independent fighting force. Now, when needed, individuals or individual heroes or units of the Vanguard Chamber will concentrate together and become a war party of their own. This is when the actual Vanguard Chamber is like released all at once for a singular mission, most often led by the Lord Aquilor. And these are not the kind of formations that you're going to see marching in lockstep. This is more of an army that is made for guerrilla assaults, right? Strike and fade attacks, or using the natural environment around them to their advantage, causing rock slides on a passing chaos army or something like that. Ways of dealing, mortal wounds to an army that aren't just standing there and fighting. So you take out the leadership or the resupply lines. You separate them with valleys and canyons, and you will watch an army dissipate in time. Generally speaking, it takes the Lord Aquilor's character to pull all of these independent agents together to make a fighting force like that happen, but when they do, it can be brutal. Especially if, say, the Lord Imperatant, that kind of hero who can operate between chambers, sees something going on and there's a new development that needs to be responded to quickly, but we don't want to move our warrior chambers out of, their position. Get together the Vanguard-Auxillary, have them knock out whatever this new threat is, and the plan will continue as indicated. Other things that we can say about them as a chamber as a whole is they're not just focused on speed. There are a lot of fast units and a lot of units that have cool, movement abilities and shenanigans and whatever you want to say. But it's also about this cunning warrior aspect. A lot of them have ranged weapons in addition to melee weapons. So like your average Liberator has no access to any kind of ranged thing. Like I said, Vanguard Hunters are much more independent and need to be able to do any job, so they have all the armaments, which just makes them incredibly interesting. So with that all out of the way, we're going to jump straight into the lore behind the units of the Vanguard Chamber. And there's not a ton of information about them individually. This book has a lot of units to introduce us to, and they kind of always focus on the newer ones, of course. But they do collectively tell the story of a different kind of warrior. A Stormcast that feels much more wild and predatory in how they fight, tracking and hunting and survivalism, which feels different than the skills and the mentality of something like, say, a Liberator, for example. And so starting at the top, again, I'm not doing any named characters in this one. We're going to do dedicated videos for them. Neve's had a whole TV series come out that I have to watch before I can talk intelligently about her as a character. But really, with her out of the way, the only hero we have is the Lord Aquilor. This is a masterful commander and a true leader of the Vanguard Chambers. He rides atop a Griff Charger, a majestic beast that lets him do these hit-and-run tactics with ease. And they are generally tasked with leading those strike groups. So you get a bunch of Vanguard people together, the Lord Aquilor is generally the one in charge, and he's going to lead them into enemy territory with precision, doing the scouting, messing up the enemy's plans, all of that. When we talk about larger armies of Vanguard units, or the strike and fade and assault, this is who's always leading them. They've been given a mission, likely by their Lord Imperatant, to aid their allies or disrupt their enemies, and for those kinds of missions, the Lord Aquilor is where the buck stops. He's your Lord Celestin equivalent for this chamber. They're often described as being very aloof because they're generally like scouting the horizon, like they're always kind of looking around, not directly at you. Their plans are vast and varied. Like they know their assets in the field, so as you're telling them what you plan to do, they're kind of doing the mental math. Kind of makes them a little bit hard to communicate with. The barrier between mortals and demigod becomes harder when the person is just kind of not listening. But honestly, that's it for heroes. They trimmed out all of the lesser heroes from this particular chamber. But there are several units below them, and in no particular order, let's jump into those. We're going to start with the beasts. My favorite are the Gryph-hounds. These are the loyal companions to the Stormcast Eternals, renowned for their crazy sharp senses that allow them to detect ambushes or sorcery, weapons, whatever. If anything had senses more attuned than those of the Vanguard chamber, it's going to be their Gryph-hounds. They're swift, agile, they bring down lightly armored foes, and just like us, we use, animals for their heightened senses all the time. It's no different. But what makes, the Gryph-hounds and Gryph Chargers so great for the Vanguard chamber is that they have a unique thing where they can actually keep up with the speeds of the chamber to do their job, meaning there are other creatures who could probably act as good alarms and sensors and that kind of stuff, but Gryph-hounds and a few of the others we'll chat about here today are the ones who can actually move at the same speeds, which is why they're valuable in this chamber specifically. Right behind them are the Ether Wings. These are celestial avian creatures that also fight alongside the Vanguard Stormcast. And these they use their speed to intercept a lot. They can either act as scouts, like during battle, like go up and maybe see an enemy coming in on a flank that the rest of the army doesn't and alert everybody, or intercept them independently, and then that'll obviously call attention to what's going on. They also have this cool trick where they can act as spotters. So the way that I'm imagining this is like an Ether Wing goes and kind of circles over an enemy that maybe the Stormcast can't see. They'll fire up into the air like an artillery barrage, and they don't need to physically see the target. It'll just aim for wherever the bird is looping. Which, the inclusion of non-direct fire was a massive revolution in military affairs. So, yeah, that's big. It also, when I think about the lore for the Vigilors, about how they can communicate orders by the rhythm and intensity of their arrow fire, I'm trying to think about that happening at the same time as Ether Wings pointing out targets. It sounds like the air is just full. There's a lot going on. Next up are the Vanguard Paladors. Now, these are the quote-unquote heavy cav of the Vanguard chambers. I say quote because it's the heaviest of the lightly armed side of Stormcast, right? They're riding these beasts called Gryph Chargers into battle, and they are essentially large animals that can do an ability called Riding the Winds Etheric, which is they kind of fade in and out of reality and teleport around the battlefield, to put it very, very simply. And this is all due to an affinity with the winds of Azyr. It makes them deadly shock troops. Essentially, they dip in between lightning arc form and then just bounce around the battlefield, attacking anything that they can. It's sort of like blipping in and out of reality. We saw a lot more of it when the Vanguard Chamber was released, but this is what separates them from the Stormstrike Paladors. Those are the Warrior Chamber versions. Stormstrikes are made for armor. Vanguard Paladors are made for speed. You can decide on your battle plan which is more important, but they essentially are the same creature, but because of their armaments, how they're weighted down, the abilities of their riders, they just have a sort of a different role. And next up are the Vanguard Raptors, and these come in two flavors. They have crossbows or the long strikes. Regardless of the weapon they choose, Vanguard Raptors are the sharpshooters of this chamber. They specialize in long-range combat, which is a hallmark of this kind of asymmetrical warfare. Again, a lot of those hit-and-run type things. They're going to pop up out of a tree, fire at the enemy's heroes, disappear. Each one of them is a master marksman and stands apart from their allies, likely because they don't experience battle in the same way. Like, when you talk to a Liberator who's getting himself pumped and psyched up to get into a fight, there's a lot of like, yeah, I'm going to smash, I'm going to punch him in the face. Whereas the Raptors tend to be much more subdued in their personality, because for them, battle takes the form of very calm, rapid-fire shots, right? They don't have the screaming and the guys punching you in the face and you're holding your shield up. Where they are, it's relatively quiet, hopefully, and in sort of a serene, dark, play that they're doing, just sniping people off from the background. They go into battle, like I said, armed with one of two weapons. They have the Hurricane crossbows, which are kind of your anti-horde choice, right? Lower impact, but a high rate of fire. It's essentially like putting 4 guns, duct taping them all together, and there you go. And then there are also the long strikes, which are much more like sniper rifles. Long range, single shot. Which you want is completely up to you and what the battle dictates. And the last unit in the Vanguard chamber are the Vanguard Hunters. These are the scouts and skirmishers of the chamber and also act as its main troop type. They're trained to operate independently behind enemy lines, sweep defense perimeters, track the enemy, all that kind of stuff. Essentially, these are warriors who are also experts at navigating difficult terrain and striking swiftly at the enemy flanks. Each one of them has a bolt storm pistol and a storm saber, and they're ideal for hit and run tactics, just kind of sowing confusion and degrading the enemy army over time. And so I want to end this video like I end all of mine by simply asking the question, why is the Vanguard chamber cool, right? It's clear that there are not a lot of units here. You have one hero and a bunch of different, mostly infantry options. But what I like about it is that it's a thematic idea of them coming together for a specific assault type. By that I mean, these characters show up in a lot of different stories as like aides and scouts, that kind of stuff. I've mentioned that to death. But the stories that we don't often see are ones where a Lord Aquilor pulls together a group of them into a singular fighting force. I would love to see more books that feature that. Because one of the things that you get, the senses that you get as you read this book, that is the battle tome for Stormcast, is that like they're just a very different kind of warrior. They don't want to fight the same way that the warrior chambers want to fight. They don't see the same paths to victory that they do, which anytime there's internal tension within a faction, I love it. It makes them interesting. These are warriors who are attrition based, meaning that's what the grand idea for Stormcast is they can die and be reforged or whatever, but they themselves do not fight an attrition war. They don't want to be cut down. And I think it would only benefit Black Library to have a book that features prominently with this particular chamber, because just like with the Ruination Chamber and the Extremists, as we'll see, they all have their own rites and rituals and personality, but that was never really articulated in this particular section of the book. All their jobs that they do are listed very thoroughly, and you get the sense that all the Sturm hosts will all have their own flavors of a Vanguard chamber. Some that focus more on beast hunting, and maybe some that focus more on hunting corrupted religious text from zealots or something like that. But not so much with what the chamber itself does. And part of that might have to do with how scattered they are. They just are that independent that they maybe don't have a strong network or foundation of rites, traditions, and beliefs. But at least giving me a book exploring one of them would be a very great insight into how they function. How do they receive orders? How are they deployed? What do they feel about their bosses, right? If you get a bunch of independent people, no one's in charge. So show me that force of will. Speaking of, one of the themes of this entire edition has been flaws in the reforging. I don't know if it's still this way, because I haven't watched the animated show, but when she was initially presented, Neve Blacktalon, the Knight Zephyros, Sigmar's assassin, was presented as she could ride the winds etheric as a result of a flaw in her reforging. So I had mentioned early in the series that it's not just memory loss, which seems to be the dominant side effect of passing the Eye of the Storm. In her case, and also in Vandis's, they got mutations. Vandis has visions. Neve Blacktalon can ride the winds etheric as if she were a Gryffstalker. Now I don't really know how useful that is now that she has a whole party of people that are constantly following around her. But conceptually, I had a Knight Zephyros on the table all the time because I just thought it was too cool. Plus, just practically speaking, when you're playing this game, having a hero that can teleport across the board it's nifty. It's never a bad idea. And I find myself looking at this chamber thinking they've got fantastic models. I love them. I'm not so much into the helmets of the Vanguard Hunters that kind of have the overdone lion aesthetic. I know some people are into it. I'm not a big fan of the lion creature specifically aesthetic with the helmets and stuff. But I think lore-wise, there is plenty of meat on the bone for them to be an exceptionally compelling place to start for storytelling. Just the fact that their battlefield is the realms themselves. Because again, they're not necessarily going against an enemy. You could be sent out to an area just to explore and encounter things that you're not ready for. They have to be able to be independent for that too. So when I think about doing a Path to Glory campaign or something like that, where narratively the position is I'm going out to explore and encounter unknown quantities of enemies, the Vanguard Chamber makes a lot of sense for that thematically. But we just don't get a lot of stories seeing that, right? We are told a lot, but we're not shown. So GW, if you're listening, show us. Give me a book about the Vanguard chamber going up against Clan Eshin of the Skaven, right? That's the whole theme right now, is Stormcast and Skaven. Show me their sneaky dudes versus our sneaky dudes. I'm just imagining a whole book of people walking around in the dark. Everyone's blind as a bat. Nobody's making a sound. All the forces are just kind of shimmying around one another, and then just halfway through the book, after no fights have been going down, you're just like, who's winning? That's what this battle sounds like to me. Not really. It sounds like there's going to be a lot of gunfire and stuff, but it would be really cool. I think it would be a great way to kill two birds with one stone. Introduce us to Eshin, or I should say reintroduce us to new lore for Eshin, as well as the Vanguard-Auxillary chamber. I would love to know your thoughts. What is your favorite unit from here? I will be honest, my favorite by far are the humble Vanguard Hunters. I love them conceptually. I love their profile of them. Get the cape, get the bolt pistol, not bolt pistol, the lightning pistol. You have a sword on their hand. It's just this great look. When I think about like the lightning paladin aesthetic, this is like the gruff survivalism warrior version of it. They make sense being dirty, not just clean, perfect plate mail. I don't know, they look awesome. I love basic units, basic infantry in just about every single chamber or army. And when they do show up in stories, typically they're hunters who are very, very helpful, like scouting information, that kind of stuff. So they're always adding to the team without trying to be, all main character energy about it. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know my buddy Jack from Rerolling Ones, he loves him some Vanguard Raptors, specifically with long strike crossbows, because they are generally pretty gross. Those are the sniper rifle ones, and on the tabletop they are deadly. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So friends, I would love to hear your thoughts on your favorite unit. Tell me in the comments down below, and we will be wrapping up our chamber exploration with the Extremist Chamber, and then we're going to have a bonus video about what the heck happened to the Sacrosanct Chamber. Thank you all for listening, and happy wargaming.